Hello and welcome to the Yes to Birth experience. I'm Rachel Yellen, and today is a glorious day because we have Dr. Sarah Buckley with us. Many of you know Dr. Sarah Buckley. I'm a little bit starstruck right now. Welcome, Sarah. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here from sunny Queensland in Australia.
Totally. So I wanted to share with everybody why I asked you to be part of the Yes to Birth experience. Besides that, you're one of the, besides that you're a family physician, besides that you're trained in family physician obstetrics, besides that you authored the internationally best-selling book Gentle Birth. When I teach my childbirth classes and my programs, I have 3 articles that I insist that every person read before they step foot into my classroom. And yours, The Hormonal Blueprint of Labor, is like one of the foundational pieces. And so I'm so grateful that that you've been contributing to, at this point, thousands of people who've taken my classes and to, of course, millions of people around the world.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So, Sarah, in addition to, what I've already shared about you, I just want to let all the Yes to Birthers know that in addition to, being an author and a doctor, and that Sarah is currently getting her PhD. She is the mother of 4 children, all born naturally, raised naturally, and her work is so incredibly supportive to parents and professionals, helping all of us to be well informed, to listen to our hearts and to our instincts. And one of the things that Sarah is really passionate about is acknowledging parents as the real experts of their bodies, babies, and their families. So, Sarah, if you can just tell us a little bit about how you got into doing this work and the I don't know, like the position that you're holding now, and that what you're really wanting to share into the world. Before we dive deeper into some specifics.
Yeah, so as you said, Rachel, I'm a doctor by training, a physician by training. So I learned a whole lot of things about birth at medical school, and then in my training as a GP obstetrics. And then I went and had my own 4 children, and it was kind of different from the other side, as many of you might recognize. And, it was such an incredibly positive, pleasurable, I would say ecstatic experience that I went away and looked at, what explains this? Like, it was such, I could actually feel it through the processes of labor, especially with my first baby. I feel like my brain kind of went like 180 degrees and ended up in a different direction, which was the direction that my baby needed me to be in. So, I went away and looked at, how does this happen? Like, how do you get these extraordinary euphoric experiences? Like, was it a one-off? Do other people have this? So I looked at physiology, at the hormones in particular. I was inspired by people like Michelle O'Donnell. And yeah, out of my own, I mean, my work is really my giveaway, because I want every mother, baby, father, and family to have the best possible start. So, and when you understand the way the hormones work, what we're talking about today, you understand why birth can go so well. And you can also understand what gets in the way, what we call hormonal gaps. So we'll talk about that. And, it's not that every woman is going to have this fantastic euphoric experience. I mean, sometimes things do go wrong and interventions needed. So how can we make birth as undisturbed, as hormonally beneficial as possible for mothers and babies and fathers and families? So that's the other question here.
Yeah, well, let's just go there. So, how does the hormonal system work to promote ease, pleasure, and safety during birth?
Well, one of the ways to look at human birth is to say that we're mammals. We have mammary glands. We suckle our young. And so the evolution of birth among mammals stretches back some 65 million years. So we are kind of the peak of evolution, you could say. But for most of that time, birth has evolved in the context of the wild. There weren't walls or villages or any way of being safe in labor. So birth has designed to be as efficient as possible. So I would call that ease, that birth in the wild is as short duration, and the pushing is as efficient as possible, so that the mother, and I'm talking about any mammals here, isn't exposed to danger as far as possible. So it's designed to be easy. It's designed to be safe, obviously, and there's lots and lots of inbuilt safety factors, which are some of which are hormonal, driven by the hormones we'll talk about. But it's also designed to be pleasurable, and that's kind of what I'm talking about as well. And what I discovered through my research is that the hormones of labor and birth actually originate in the brain, where they stimulate the pleasure and reward centers, and that's part of the design. Because any mammalian mother, like a dog, a cat, an elephant, they don't go to prenatal classes to learn how to take care of their babies, right? It has to kick in straight away as soon as the baby's born. So what happens is that the reward and pleasure centers of the mother are stimulated in labor and birth, on top of the preparations that happen up to that point, so that when the mother meets her baby for the first time, she goes, oh, this is my baby. This is the most pleasurable and rewarding thing in the world. Yeah, she gets off to a good start, and then she'll be rewarded and motivated to give that dedicated care that every mammalian newborn needs. So it's an intrinsic part of the design, and that's why I call it ecstatic birth, nature's hormonal blueprint for labor. And the book that you're talking about is available on my website, so we'll have the links there. You can go and read all the detail that we'll talk about as well.
Beautiful. Well, I want to just dive deeper and have you share, what are the key hormones that are taking place, that are arising organically during birth? What changes? What changes for a woman, and what are the things that she really needs to do to facilitate this shift in her hormones and create an abundance of the hormones that are needed?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk mostly about oxytocin, because that's actually the research I'm doing at the moment, but there are other hormonal systems. And I'd also recommend, if you'll put the link in here, if people want to know kind of all the science, that they look at I'll just get a copy of it, my undisturbed birth, my hormonal physiology of childbearing report, which was published in 2015. I just hold it up here, and it's available as a totally free download. So that's got all the science that I'm talking about. If you want to know, well, why does she say that, then I recommend you go look at that.
Tell us the name of it, and where do they go to find that? Because that's amazing.
Yeah, it's called Hormonal Physiology of Childbearing. I'll show the cover again. Sorry about there we go. Hormonal Physiology of Childbearing. So it's a website. It's published by Childbirth Connection, and it's available as a totally free PDF download. So go and look it up, read at least the executive summary. And if you're curious about particular topics, you can go in there and find more about what I'm saying. So oxytocin is the biggest chapter in there, because it is the hormone that we know most about. And it's also the most famous birth hormone. It's called oxy. Oxy means fast, tocin means birth. So it's discovered as the hormone that makes birth go fast. So it causes the rhythmic contractions of labor. We've known that for a while. And not just causes the rhythmic contractions of labor, but the whole oxytocin system, like all of these hormone systems, is prepared, or we say upregulated, in the lead up to labor, so that when the woman releases, the laboring female releases oxytocin in labor, it comes into her system that's maximally sensitive to it. And that's a system we call hormone receptors. So just going back a step, a hormone's a substance made in one part of the body that has effects in another part of the body. And the way it has effects is it binds to a receptor, and it's a bit like putting a key into a lock. So the hormone oxytocin is released from the brain, travels down to the uterus. It finds the receptors on the outside of the uterine cell walls. It binds to those receptors like putting a key into a lock, turns the lock, sends a chemical message into the cell saying contract. So that's the way that oxytocin causes the contractions in labor, via the receptors. And just as levels can go up and down, receptor numbers can go up and down. And we know that in the uterus in women, receptor numbers increase in the lead up to labor, so that at that point of spontaneous, or what I call physiological onset labor, the woman's uterus is maximally sensitive to oxytocin. So she actually doesn't need to release a lot in labor, and suddenly everything will happen. Her uterus will start contracting, and she'll get into some positive feedback cycles that I'll talk about in a minute. So oxytocin is, as I said, released from the brain. So there's a whole lot of things happening in the brain. So within the brain, as it's released during labor, it has intrinsic pain relieving effects. It switches on the parasympathetic, the relaxation and growth, the calm and connection system, and switches off the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system. So it helps to put women into this altered state, this calm and connection state as far as possible inside the intensity of labor and birth, because no doubt it is an intense experience, but our hormones are there to help us to deal with the intensity of labor, as well as to make sure labor is as efficient as possible. So here we have oxytocin released from the brain, calming, connecting, pain relieving, and also activating those pleasure and reward centers. So that at that moment of birth, as we meet our babies for the first time, we have this rush of pleasure, of reward, of I say it's like the best first date ever when we meet our babies. Yeah, this is my baby. This is a maximum sense of maximum pleasure and reward to me. So the brain, the central effects, as we say, of oxytocin are important, but also these peripheral effects, these effects of oxytocin causing the rhythmic contractions of labor. So that's happening as labor goes ahead. We get a little bit more oxytocin released, a little bit more stronger contractions. And there's a point at which oxytocin activates what I call positive feedback loops. And I'm going to refer you back to my website. We'll put the link there for two blogs where I talk about epidurals. It's got a picture of these positive feedback loops. But basically what happens in labor is that oxytocin is released from the brain, it goes down to the uterus, binds with the receptors, as we say, causes strong contractions, and the sensations from those strong contractions by specific nerves go back to the brain, giving the brain feedback saying release more oxytocin. You've got more oxytocin released in the brain, more traveling to the uterus, stronger contractions, more sensations, more feedback. So it's a positive feedback loop that has labor get bigger and bigger. I call it like the snowball of labor. Labor gets faster and faster and bigger, and the contractions get stronger and stronger, and that's active labor. Yeah, but it's happening because of this feedback, because of the sensations of labor feeding back to the brain. So this is women, this is all animals, and this happens even more so as the time of birth gets closer. So as the mother's contractions get stronger and stronger, the baby gets down low and the mother's birth canal, very strong sensations. You might remember that yourself if you've had a baby, very strong feedback. So at that point of pushing her baby out, she's getting all of this hormonal help to make sure that the pushing stage is as quick and efficient as possible, because again, imagining giving birth in the wild, it's just not safe for a mother to be hanging around trying to push her baby out for hours and hours. I mean, she'd be taken by a predator, the baby would be taken by a predator. So there's all these intrinsic hormonal processes that make birth as easy, pleasurable, and safe as possible. So that's one of those things. And I'll just expand on that a little bit to say that what happens to that positive feedback loop when a woman has an epidural, because this is what we're talking about in the blog. So if we abolish the sensations very effectively, as an epidural usually does, it means that there's none of this positive feedback loop. It basically abolishes the positive feedback loop, which means that the woman's oxytocin system winds down, and often her contractions wind down, labor slows down or even stops. And then what happens? We need to give her synthetic oxytocin. We've caused a hormonal gap. Yeah, we've caused a gap between what should have happened and what actually did happen. There's a gap in her oxytocin in her body, but also in her brain. So she's not getting these calming, connecting, pain relieving effects. She's not getting the activation of the pleasure and reward centers. And that's probably one of the most significant and really not known effects of having an epidural. It changes a mother's, or it stops the changes that naturally happen in the mother's brain that help her to feel euphoric and bond with her baby after the birth. So it's a big hormonal gap caused by epidurals. And again, you can go to my website and read about that. And I just want to say, I'm not saying that if you've had an epidural, you can't bond with your baby or it's going to be really difficult. But, this is Mother Nature's best start. This is the best possible start, where we have that intrinsic reward and motivation. We have actually a change in our personalities that happens during physiological labor and birth, natural, normal, this term physiological, like aligned with biology. And so our personality changes after birth. So we become more sociable, we become more relaxed, we have less tension. And again, these changes don't happen in women who've had an epidural. There's a hormonal gap there. And I'll continue on a little bit and say, what can we do about those hormonal gaps? Because obviously sometimes these things are necessary. Sometimes all the interventions that we talk about are life-saving for mothers and babies. So the first thing we need to know is there is a hormonal gap. Something's happened, or something hasn't happened that should have happened. Yeah. So the mother doesn't have the oxytocin in her body, doesn't have the oxytocin in her brain. So of course, filling in the gap in the body, we can do that with synthetic oxytocin. We can get the woman's contractions going stronger and stronger, and hopefully that That'll give her what she needs to push her baby out in the end. It's going to be a more difficult pushing stage because that positive feedback loop that's so strong on the pushing stage is also not working. So unfortunately, with an epidural, you're more likely to need forceps or vacuum to help to push the baby out. So that's the gap that can be filled in to some extent by synthetic oxytocin or pitocin. But unfortunately, and again, this is in my some of my blogs, synthetic oxytocin doesn't cross back into the brain. So remember how I said oxytocin is released from the brain into the body? That's the way it happens biologically. But when we give it into the body, as in an infusion of synthetic oxytocin, pitocin, also called syntocinon, it doesn't go back into the brain because we have uh, this this barrier called the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is very important. It means we can regulate what's inside our brain. We can control our brain and the brain processes. But in this situation, giving synthetic oxytocin, it's blocked from getting into the brain. So it can't cause the calm, connection, pain-relieving effect. So unfortunately, when we get this drug, we get the stronger contractions, but without those extra things to help. So again, it's another hormonal gap that we've caused there. So how can we fill in those hormonal gaps? Well, it's a little bit difficult to do in labor, but after the birth, we can fill in those hormonal gaps by skin to skin, which releases oxytocin for mothers and babies, and by breastfeeding, which also releases oxytocin for mothers and babies. But if you have this hormonal gap, you've not only missed the hormones, but you've missed a window of opportunity. Remember I said how the uterine receptors build up and at peak levels in the lead up to labor? Well, everything's basically like that. There's a whole suite of preparations that happen, and you can read this in chapter 2 in my report, that lead up to the physiological onset of labor. And when I teach workshops about this, I say, inducing labor or a pre-labor cesarean is a bit like William and Kate, Prince William and Kate turning up at Westminster Cathedral for the wedding, like a week or a month or a day or even an hour before the scheduled time, and expecting everything to be the same, and it just isn't. Yeah, there's a gap in the preparations as well. So when we miss that window of opportunity, we've missed all those preparations, we've missed the processes of labor and birth to some extent. So we can fill in the hormonal gaps, but we need to be a lot more patient. Yeah. So with the research I was telling you about, where the women who'd had an epidural didn't get those changes in personality, well, they did eventually get them through months of breastfeeding. So they filled in the hormonal gaps through that constant release of oxytocin with each breastfeeding episode. So it took several months. It was measured at 6 months to be the same as women who hadn't had an epidural. And I'll just share another anecdote, because obviously we haven't talked about cesareans, but that is the most consequential intervention for all these hormones. And of course, again, sometimes it's needed, sometimes it's essential to preserve the life of mother and or baby. So nothing wrong with these interventions when they're needed. But obviously, especially a pre-labor cesarean, a big hormonal gap, like no pre-labor preparations, no in-labor processes, the mother's not quite ready, the baby's not quite ready, and we can't even judge the level of unreadiness because we don't know for that individual mother and baby when labor would have naturally happened. Yeah, so other animals, some animals go, like rats go into labor on day 22, but women have this wide range of natural labor onset from 37 weeks to 42 weeks. So, and some women even longer. So there is going to be a gap there, but we don't even know how big the gap is. Yeah. So gap for the mother and all of these systems we're talking about, gap for the baby in another system. Maybe we'll come back to that, the catecholamine system, which explains the baby's difficulties with making that transition, with especially with the pre-labor cesarean. But basically, we've got all these hormonal gaps going on when you have a pre-labor cesarean. So again, what is the way to fill in that hormonal gap? Is skin to skin and breastfeeding. It's Mother Nature's backup system, I call it sometimes. But again, it's going to take longer. And I'll share an anecdote, which is a mama who had 2 natural births and then had to have a pre-labor cesarean. And she said, when I got my baby felt different. And the baby was different, and she was different. Everything was different from a hormonal perspective. And she said, my instinct was to be skin to skin with my baby. And she said, after 3 days of skin to skin with my baby felt the same. So there's been a hormonal gap, she's filled it in, but she's had to do a lot more work. You could have half an hour of labor and no hormonal gap, but you need 3 days of skin to skin and breastfeeding to fill in that hormonal gap. So yeah, that's kind of one of the take home messages, is know what the hormonal gaps are and, do what you can to fill it in with skin to skin and breastfeeding.
Sarah, you have given us so much vital information so compactly and so succinctly. And One question that, that comes up, because in terms of the mammalian response, and what is it that makes, why are animals in the wild having such an easy time for the most part? And why are women in all different kinds of birth environments having such a hard time? I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, that's a very big question. And, from a hormonal perspective, and this is again a take-home message here, the most critical thing for any birthing mammal is that they feel private, safe, and unobserved. Yeah, because you think a mama of any species giving birth in the wild, she needs to know she's in the safest place because she's going to have these, potential dangerous things happen to her. So, an animal giving birth in the wild is and a mother, it's hardwired into us. We're very sensitive to our surroundings. And you may have noticed that in labor, women seem to be in this altered state, but they're actually very sensitive to what's going on around them. And they can even hear someone in the next room talking about themselves or their baby, right? We've got these highly, and that's critical in the wild. Yeah. So there has to be a way for these birth hormones to unfold, and especially oxytocin. Some people call it the shy hormone. There has to be a way for the laboring mother to feel private, safe, and unobserved. And women know this. They'll kind of find the smallest room, especially with the first baby, because things take longer. This whole processes have never happened before, so it takes longer. It's a bit more, you could say, wobbly with a first baby. It takes longer for those positive feedback loops to get going, for the mother to get into active labor. So often a first-time mama, it's typical, she'll go into the toilet or the smallest room or the bathroom, wherever she can kind of feel really enclosed and private and safe. And along those same lines, one way of looking at it is to say that having a baby, the hormonal physiology of having a baby is almost identical to the hormonal physiology of making a baby. So, if you set yourself up a situation where you could make a baby, then that's a good situation to have a baby. And I'm not saying we've all got to be in a cave or be by ourselves, but there's ways of doing that. Take a doula with you to hospital. Take people that can look after your space. Take your own. All these labor processes we're talking about are happening in the middle layer of the brain called the limbic system, and it's a very, you could say, mammalian part of the brain. And that it's got a sensitivity to the surroundings. It's got an alarm system, you could say. So we need to be kind to the limbic system. Dim lights, all the things that making a baby easy. Few noises, no distractions, feeling safe, having people around you that you feel safe with, but also a sense of smell, like trying to bring in familiar smells. That's very much connected to the limbic system. So, in my workshops, we actually do a section where I learned so much from midwives. What can you do to help women to feel undisturbed in labor? So taking your own pillow and burying yourself into your pillow and just, cutting out those external noises. Wear headphones, wear earplugs, wear an eye mask, go into your own space so that you can feel private, safe, and unobserved. And the last answer to your question, and again, this is a big topic, is, we have this limbic system where all these things are happening that we share with other mammals. But then as humans, we have this neocortex, this big new brain, that we've developed over the last maybe, 100, 500,000 years. And so we have all these higher order thoughts. We have an intellectual idea of safety, for example. We can feel concerned about relationships that are there in the space. So we need to be able to let go of our neocortex, as Anna Gaskin said, let your monkey do it, sink down into that limbic system. And again, how can you arrange the space so that you can do that? So you're not going to have any social worries about who's there, arrange a space where that's flexible for what you feel like in that situation. Make things, so that people, you can decide who's there or who's not there at any time according to what's right for you. Again, Anna May says, if a woman isn't feeling like a goddess in labor, then people aren't treating her right. Yeah. So
Mm.
your own well-being in labor and your own mental state. And, traditional cultures have known this, that their number one priority has been the woman's emotional state in labor. And somehow that's kind of got down the bottom of our list of priorities. And I think that's really the major reason why women have difficulty giving birth these days. We're not paying attention to that. And we're not also paying attention to that in labor. And of course, there's a cultural fear around birth, and we take that on, and it lives in our neocortex. And, so addressing those things as well during the preparation that you need so that you can really sink into your limbic system in labor and birth.
Awesome. So, the takeaway really, of course, is that private, safe, and undisturbed. And
Yeah,
it's,
exactly.
you remind me in terms of, the sense of smell that I was at a birth many years ago, and the mom kept saying, Dan, her husband was Dan. She said, I need to smell you. And she literally grab him and pull him.
Yeah.
She would put her face in his neck and just be like,
Yeah.
and she just
Yeah.
like that was what she needed, and I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
There, one
And
of
that's oxytocin as well. Oxytocin is connected to the sense of smell too. So she
right,
was upregulating her oxytocin system by smelling him too. Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Sarah, one of the things that I really, that we know is so common is the use of Pitocin, not only to induce labor, but of course to augment labor. Can you just give us, a little outline of like, where does Pitocin come from? How is it regulated? And you've already talked about, that Pitocin, doesn't go through the blood-brain barrier, but just give us a little bit more because it's so common. People think it's not a big deal. It doesn't have any, it's fine. So tell
Mm.
us more about that.
Well, the interesting thing about Pitocin is the more I find out about it, the less I know about it, because really, I mean, it's quite incredible. Like for a drug that's so commonly used, probably the most commonly used drug in all of maternity care, we really don't know a lot about the effects of it. We really haven't done the research to look at longer term effects. And these are some of the things we're looking at in my research, in the short term and the longer term. So synthetic oxytocin is a biochemically equivalent to oxytocin. It's the same molecule exactly, but it has different effects in the body because it's not made in the brain. So it's not having all those beneficial brain effects. It's injected into the body and it can't go back into the brain. So that's one thing.
How is it?
Another thing. Hmm?
How is it made?
Oh, well, initially, if you want to know the whole story, initially, actually, when it was discovered, it was actually a researcher called Sir Henry Dale who did experiments on labouring cats. So he fed them pituitary extracts, and the oxytocin in the pituitary extract then caused their labour to go fast. So it was used, my dad was actually an obstetrician, and he used a drug called pituitrin, which was originally pituitary extracts. And then in the 50s, it was chemically synthesized. So the ones that we use now is a chemically synthesized version of that. So it's a very pure form of oxytocin, which is good, but it doesn't have those same effects because it's not produced in the brain and going into the body. It's given into the body and not doesn't go back to the brain. But another important aspect of synthetic oxytocin is that it's given by infusion in these constant high dose levels. So when we release oxytocin in labour from the pituitary into the body, we get a big pulse of it and then levels go down. We get another pulse of it and levels go down. So it's a pulsatile release. And that is actually magically or biologically the most effective way of keeping the oxytocin receptors sensitive. So when the oxytocin, they get some stimulation, then they get a bit of break, and then they get some stimulation, then they get a bit of a break. So that keeps our oxytocin receptors happy, you could say. But when we expose the receptors at this constant high dose, our receptors do something very sensible, which is kind of a general biological principle, is they protect us from overstimulation by reducing numbers, down-regulating. We call it desensitizing. So the mother's uterus actually becomes desensitized to oxytocin, either her own oxytocin or the synthetic oxytocin. So constant high dose oxytocin, synthetic oxytocin, kind of runs out of its use after a while. And one of the major impacts of that is then after the birth, when we need good levels of oxytocin to contract our uterus after the babies come out and prevent bleeding, we don't have that ability to respond because we've down-regulated our oxytocin receptors. Our uterus is desensitized, yeah? So women who have synthetic oxytocin in labor, especially long, high doses of it, are at increased risk of postpartum hemorrhage. So that's one effect of the receptors, and it's very well known. In fact, I think it's even on the product packaging these days. So it's well recognised that you have that risk. So if you do have synthetic oxytocin in labour, you do need it afterwards. But something else to say about just going back a step. So when we release oxytocin in labour naturally, we have this exquisite sensitivity to it. So we don't need very much to make labour happen. And then we get into these positive feedback cycles and then everything happens. Like the snowball gets bigger and bigger, becomes unstoppable, the baby's born, yeah. But when we're given synthetic oxytocin, it's likely that our receptors, we're going to have fewer receptors. We're not going to have that peak number that we would have at the physiological onset of labour. So we're going to need more synthetic oxytocin than we would naturally produce. So we have higher levels, 2, 3, 5 times higher levels from what's been measured in some of the studies. So we have higher levels that cause stronger contractions that we would naturally get at that stage of labor. And that can interfere with the baby's hormonal protective system too. That's the catecholamine system. So we can talk about that in a minute. But basically, it causes more stress to the baby. So you need monitoring. I say to women, if you're offered an intervention and it requires monitoring, there's a risk. So it can cause more stress to the baby. The baby's not ready for it. It can cause, you can need to have interventions because of that extra stress to the baby as well. But the other thing to say about oxytocin, and this was something that I learned through the years of research that I did, is that people would say that, well, if you give synthetic oxytocin, the mother's going to stop making her own. But that's actually not true. So that is true in a homeostatic hormonal situation, like you and I sitting here, our blood pressure's level, because if it gets a little bit high, we've got these mechanisms to bring it down. Our cortisol, our stress hormones level, because if it gets too high, we've got mechanisms to bring it down. So we're in homeostasis. We're the same, yeah? Our physiology is tracking along just nicely like this. But labor is not nicely like this, right? Labor is this. Labor is an accelerating, the snowball of labor. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger because of these feedback cycles. So what that means is that, sorry, I just lost what I was saying. Synthetic oxytocin. So what that means with these positive feedback cycles, what that means is that giving synthetic oxytocin doesn't reduce our release of it. And in fact, if giving synthetic oxytocin causes strong enough contractions to give that feedback to the brain, and causing strong enough tractions means the woman's at an adequate state of readiness, got enough receptors, for example, to cause strong contractions and give that feedback to the brain, then sometimes synthetic oxytocin can make this whole feedback loop start. So you may recognize this. Some women, they go into be induced, they get a little bit of synthetic oxytocin, everything happens, the positive feedback loop starts going and they have their baby quite quickly. While they have a high number of receptors, they probably would have gone into labor tomorrow, right? Or within 24 hours. And some women, you pour bucket loads in and nothing happens because they don't have the adequate readiness, they don't have the number of receptors to get that positive feedback loop going. So take home message, synthetic oxytocin doesn't reduce our own oxytocin. If it triggers labor, it could even increase the amount of oxytocin in the brain and get the whole labor started. And that positive feedback loop, I hope I'm not giving too much detail, but I really recommend you go and read the blogs on my site. But that positive feedback loop really also explains why there's so many different ways of inducing, if anything that causes strong enough contractions with the woman at an adequate stage of readiness will trigger labor. So sex, castor oil, prostaglandins, Foley catheters, there's so many different ways of inducing labor if the woman's at that state of readiness. It gets her onto that feedback loop and then everything just starts happening, including the release of oxytocin in her brain. So I hope I haven't given you too much detail. It is quite a complex system, but really, the take-home message is it doesn't reduce the amount of oxytocin in the brain. It may benefit by putting us onto that positive feedback loop, but at the same time, it can cause extra stress for the baby, and those stronger contractions can cause extra stress for the mother. And some studies have actually shown that extra stress continues on after the birth, higher blood pressure levels, higher stress hormone levels during breastfeeding. And what that means on the longer term, again, it's things we're looking at, but we don't really know what the kind of longer term effects might be.
Sarah, what do you think of the standard use of Pitocin after the baby is born in a birth where no Pitocin was used as induction or augmentation?
Yeah, so again, that's a big topic. So there was developed this system of preventing, it's all about preventing hemorrhage, right? And that's a really important thing. It's a major cause of maternal death worldwide. We don't want to have a big hemorrhage, although given that most healthy, low-risk women in wealthy countries can afford to lose like 500 mils, or it's about a pint, or even 1,000 mils. I say in my workshops, I say, what happens when you go and do a blood donation? You lose a pint of blood, you get tea and biscuits. What happens when you lose a pint of blood after birth? Like everything breaks loose, and women in pregnancy have extra blood, so they can actually afford to lose it generally. I'm not saying every woman, but generally a healthy woman. So there's been a little bit of overreaction, you could say, to mild to moderate postpartum hemorrhage, I think. But at the same time, of course, we don't want to have big hemorrhages that can potentially endanger the life of mothers. So they developed this system called active management of labour, and that included synthetic oxytocin, included early cord clamping, included pulling on the cord to control cord traction to pull the placenta out. And that's kind of gone out of fashion in most places, because they figured out that probably the pulling of the cord and probably the early cord clamping didn't contribute to preventing hemorrhage. And so what's left now generally is the synthetic oxytocin. And look, if a woman's bleed, it does cause the uterus to contract, so it can treat bleeding. But the question is, do women who've had no risk factors, you remember we talked about synthetic oxytocin in labour is a risk factor for bleeding after birth, but if she's had this totally normal natural birth, does she need synthetic oxytocin? Well, the answer to that from a hormonal perspective is no. And the reason for that is because the natural sequence of events after a birth is the baby comes onto the mother's body, the baby does the breast crawl. Again, I recommend you look up breast crawl. So the baby knows how to find the nipple. The baby will crawl up the mother's belly. Actually, the baby steps. The baby has these stepping reflexes. The baby has a whole lot of reflexes that we learned, I learned about at medical school, but we didn't really know what they were for. And we didn't even think that a human baby could find the breast just like every other mammalian baby could. I mean, it's quite crazy, really. And then we discovered that like it's brand new. Never knew it before. But anyway, the baby has all these reflexes that help the baby to find the breast and attach. And one of them is a stepping reflex. So on the way up, the baby actually steps on the mother's uterus and helps the mother's uterus to contract. But once the baby gets in the vicinity of the mother's breast, the first thing the baby does, actually, if we don't disturb the baby, is massage the nipple with the hand. So the baby hand massages the nipple, then the baby starts sucking the fist and gets all the saliva, digestive systems going, and then the baby starts suckling. And those pre-breastfeeding behaviors, particularly the massaging of the mother's nipple, increase the release of oxytocin in the mother. So that's the mother's own natural prevention of hemorrhage. She gets naturally her own oxytocin release through these interactions with her baby, the pre-breastfeeding behaviors, a nipple massage, and then when the baby starts suckling. So if the baby's there, the baby's the one that causes or protects the mother from bleeding. And what we've done in our Western medical system, we've taken the baby away, we've caused a hormonal gap for the mother, and then we've given synthetic oxytocin to help close that hormonal gap. So the take-home message is that the mother, after the birth, the mother needs the baby on her to release the oxytocin just as much as the baby needs the mother. Yeah. So when the mother, and there's increasing, like the question you're asking, there's, I've been following this for like 15 years, and there wasn't really any research to guide that in the beginning, and now we're getting more and more studies showing that, yes, exactly, after physiological birth, the mother's at no more increased risk of postpartum hemorrhage, and she really doesn't need the synthetic oxytocin, according to all these studies that have been done. But if she does have interventions, including synthetic oxytocin, probably epidurals, because they tend to come with synthetic oxytocin, then she probably does need something to close that hormonal gap after the birth. And also, she may not have that ability, again, from studies that have been done, when the baby does get on her body and do the breast core, she doesn't release as much oxytocin either. So hormonal gaps, but during the birth and after the birth, following an epidural. But still, just getting breastfeeding, I still stand by that, but you're going to have to do more of it.
Awesome. You have so much information, and I could just listen. It's like, and the speed at which the speed and the generosity with which you give out is totally amazing. So thank you so much for that. There's so many more things that we could talk about, but I want to, in terms of, the chosen interventions and why they should and shouldn't be avoided and the impact of these interventions. But I want you to just direct people where they can get more information about these really important topics, because everything that you're pointing to is the gateway to this healthier, less painful, empowering, satisfying pregnancy and birth. So direct us where we need to go to really be informed, and where parents can make informed choices, and where birth workers, birth providers can get clear about what's really needed to create this better birth experience.
So definitely go to my website and you'll have the link there and sign up and you'll get my free ebook, Ecstatic Birth, Nature's Hormonal Blueprint for Labour, which actually I wrote originally back in 2002, and it's written for parents. It was written for a parenting magazine called Mothering, and I've kept updating it, but it's really written in quite simple language. It's easy to understand, which is why it's so great for parents. So definitely get that one. If you want more detail, my book, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering, available on all the Amazons. That has a whole chapter on undisturbed birth as well. So that's a kind of another level of detail about the hormones. And as I mentioned, my hormonal physiology report, it's a free download. And again, we'll have the links there underneath. So all of those are really gives increasing level of detail. I might also offer workshops around the world at different times. So make sure get on my email list to find out about that. And I have actually a DVD of my workshops called Undisturbed Birth. So again, you'll find that on my website. So if you can't get to a workshop, you can buy the DVD, take me home, fast forward and rewind me, as I say, and it's got a lot of this information in as well.
So for all the Yes to Birthers, go to www.sarah with an H, SARAHBUCKLEY.com. And she also has another website, which is gentlenaturalbirth.com. And you can also, the article that that Sarah wrote that she's referring to in the 2002, that's also on my childbirth resources page at yestobirth.com. So you can read her article there and follow her through there. Sarah, the last thing that I wanted to, well, I have two sort of last things. You've given birth to 4 children, and you've told us some of the things that really make a difference in childbirth. But given everything that you know now, if you could go back to each of those younger versions of yourself who were giving birth, what advice would you give?
Well, I think it's the advice that I'll give everyone really, Rachel, which is trust your body. You know, your body is superbly designed, and all of the information that I give out is really reassuring women, reassuring birth care providers, reassuring partners that our bodies actually know how to do it. Yeah, our body is superbly designed for this whole process. So trust your body and trust your baby, and private, safe, and unobserved, the key, the core requirements for birth in all mammals.
Beautiful. Is there anything that you want to say to the Yes to Birthers here, if you were to look into their eyes and have them, take away, the one pearls, or anything that you'd like to say as your parting words?
Yeah, I trust your body and trust your baby, and enjoy it. It's designed to be an enjoyable, a positive experience.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Buckley, for being here with the Yes to Birth experience. It has been a huge joy and pleasure, and thank you for the generosity with which you have shared, decades of research and practice and being a mom, which is
Pleasure.
life unto itself. For all the
Yeah.
Yes to Birthers, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thanks, Rachel. My pleasure. Bye.
That you're a part of the Yes to Birth movement. Please visit yestobirth.com to learn more about my pregnancy, birth, and beyond audio relaxation program, my childbirth education and techniques programs, and my private counseling and coaching. Yes to Birth. I'm Rachel Yellen. Bye.